Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar titled An Introduction to Grief and Loss. Thank you so much for joining us today. This session is part of Prepared Together, Canadian Red Cross Disaster Preparedness Virtual Learning Series. Today's session is presented in English. The spring and summer of 2024 are predicted to bring an unprecedented level of intensity for emergencies across the country. The goal of the Canadian Red Cross Disaster Preparedness Series is to support people and communities to prepare for, increase their resilience to, and respond to future disasters. We are hosting learning sessions throughout the summer in both English and French. You can use the QR code on your screen to visit our website to learn more and register for our other programming. We will also post the webpage in the chat in both English and French. There it is. And just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's session will be recorded and sent to all registrants. We will also post recordings on our webinar series webpage. Closed captioning is available in both English and French. Just click the closed captioning button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. At the end of today's session, we will also have a Q&A period. So please leave your questions in the Q&A box in the control panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the session. After you close this webinar screen, we'll also have a feedback survey pop up on your browser with a few questions asking how we did today. We will also have a resource package from our learning sessions and this slide deck shared on the CRC webpage. All right, I would now like to introduce to you today our Canadian Red Cross presenters, Jackie Jesso and Vicki Walker. Hi.
Hi, everyone. Jackie, you're still on mute. I'm sorry to bother you.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. My name's Jackie. I'm a senior manager for mental health and psychosocial support. And I'm working today with Vicki and April on providing you with this presentation and knowledge share. One of the reference points that's profoundly important to me as I think about grief and loss today is the impact of the pandemic and the impact the pandemic has had on all of us, and very specifically the people in my family and the rhythm of life since that time. So I'll hand it over to Vicki to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vicki Walker. I'm the Senior Manager of Education and Training with the Risk Reduction and Resilience National Team. And I asked to join the session because grief and loss is something that has profoundly impacted my life and my career as well. So beginning with the loss of my mother at 13, that changed my one person, and it was a teacher, changed the course of my life because I went into high school education for over 2 decades and studied grief and loss while I was in university. So I'm privileged to be here. And to continue with that, I would also like to begin our land acknowledgement. I live on the lands of Fort William First Nation, their traditional territories outside of Thunder Bay, Ontario. And at this time, I would like to ask everyone to share where you're from in the chat. We acknowledge that much of our work in Canada is on the traditional treaty and unceded territories home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Each of us resides on the traditional land of the First Peoples of Turtle Island and in the traditional lands of the Inuit peoples of the North. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the shared history of our Indigenous peoples and settlers on this land. Please take a moment, share in the Zoom chat where you're from or where you live today. Feel free to provide an additional land acknowledgement if you know what territory you're from. And moments like this allow us to connect in the spirit of collaboration, friendship, and reconciliation, to value ways of knowing, being, and learning together, and learning about the Indigenous peoples and ourselves across Turtle Island. Thank you. While you're entering that in the chat, I'd like to talk about the 7 fundamental principles of the Canadian Red Cross. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has 7 fundamental principles, which we also honor in Canada. Interestingly, these principles align with the Indigenous peoples of Canada and 7 sacred teachings. While these may vary from a different nation to nation across Turtle Island, where I live on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people in the Robinson Superior Treaty Zone, these are also known as the grandfather teachings. What to expect from our time together today. We're going to go through 4 different topics prior to going into a question and answer and debrief session as needed. And we're going to start off with what is grief and what are significant losses, because these are different. So we're going to explain how grief and loss are different and how they may show up in different types of grief and loss. Lastly, we're going to discuss how we can support one another. And we welcome you at our various questions and interactive pieces to share in the chat your learnings and how we can support one another. At the end of the session, we'll be following up with some questions. At this time, we're going to ask that you place your questions in the Q&A section, not in the chat section of this webinar. So if you have questions, we'll make sure we'll circle back to them at the end. And we ask you to help participate and make this a really collaborative learning session with all of us by using the chat features. Thank you. Jackie, it's over to you now.
Thank you. Now, the first question is, what is significant loss? Now, just to explain significant, what we think about when we're using this word here is something that's really important for us to pay attention to, something that could be missed if we're not eyes wide open. So significant loss can be any of the following and more. People, places, and things we value and rely on. Daily routines that support our health, our well-being, our livelihoods, and structure our time with family, with friends, on our own, with our workplaces. Animals, pets, and the natural world. Things we do, the time we spend, the people we interact with, and the places we go for healing, spiritual, creative, and cultural activities. And there are other losses as well. Other losses that present in all emergencies in one form or another, but particularly in large-scale emergencies, are fundamental losses in terms of freedom and our capacity to move, to learn, to work, to meet our basic needs and to help others, to be creative and to express ourselves, and to be safe from harm, and to make decisions to support our community's well-being. When we have large-scale disasters and even small ones, all of these things are impacted, and it can change our experience of our life and how effective we feel in it.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone to engage in our first question in the chat. And Jackie had mentioned earlier, we talked about the pandemic being a loss. I've experienced familial loss. What significant losses have occurred for you or for your community as a whole? If you could take a couple minutes and share that in the chat, we'd be greatly appreciated. So in the chat, we have people sharing about from disasters, house, floods, pets, family, parents. And special acknowledgement to someone from Lytton, BC, who, as we know, was devastating events there. Business is closing. That's an important one, actually, especially if they're community hub. Jobs, family members. Thank you for that. We'll invite you to please keep sharing in that. Part of what we're doing here is also creating a community of learners, and we'll be sharing a lot more resources and knowledge as we go forward. Jackie, did you want to discuss grief?
Sure. You can move on to the next slide. Yeah. So grief, big word, big feeling, big experience. What is it? Very briefly, it's universal, it's natural, and it's painful. Let's think more about what it is. So it's our natural human experience, and it's experienced by many social animals. So dolphins, elephants, you've probably noticed it in your pets. If you have 2, 3, or more, and one pet has died or has, for some reason, not part of the family right now, it's something that we can see in animals, we can see in each other, and we can feel when we stand beside or near to people and animals who've experienced loss. It's a profound break in our social bonds that sustain us. So as social creatures and social beings, we rely on each other for our best health and our best life. And when we don't have those bonds, our life changes. So the losses of these social bonds and relationships can occur for us as individuals. They can occur for whole groups of people, communities, for nations, and they can occur for us globally. And the pandemic is an example of that, or health emergencies. So grief is what happens within us, inside us, and inside our communities and our relationships with ourselves and each other in response to significant losses. So how are they different, grief and loss? They're often paired together, which makes sense. Loss is also a natural part of our human experience. It happens to all living beings and life forms. It's about change, and it's about specific change. It's about change that can't be restored. So loss can be, again, an individual or a collective experience. And when we think about loss today, what we're thinking about is the catalyst for grief. It's the event or the thing that happens to activate our grief response. Now, people in this room today have clearly experienced all of these different types of losses. There's 3 primary types, but indeed the qualities of each type vary with the person in their community, their context, and the types of resources they had before the loss and the types of support they have now. The first type of loss is the sudden loss. So that's the loss that occurs without warning at all. So there's no time to prepare oneself or others. It's a surprise. The next loss is ambiguous loss. And ambiguous, what we mean by that is simply that it's an unclear, uncertain loss. So there might be a physical absence, so a person might not be near to us, but it's not clear if their absence is temporary or permanent. So when somebody goes missing, we don't know for sure if something terrible has happened to them or if it's a temporary loss and they're going to return to us. There's also the psychological absence. The person might be there or the community might be there, but there's something that's happened. It doesn't feel the same. They don't seem to be the same person. It's more difficult to establish the bond, the connection with them. Cumulative loss is quite simply, when we experience a lot of losses. They can occur all at the same time, like with a large-scale emergency or a community emergency, where there's loss of health supports, there's loss of family members, there's loss of land, there's loss of work, there's financial losses. They can also be losses that occur serially, like historical losses, plus residential schools, for example, plus children who die at schools, for example, or families that experience other types of difficulties and complexities that diminish their capacity to restore each other and to be in relationship to one another. So these different types of losses all have profound impact on us, and they all take a lot of time to recover from.
Before we move into our next question, I just wanted to say a collective thank you to everyone that participated in the chat. And as I'm watching it here, we have loss of property, loss of country, loss of families, loss of people close to us to illness, our fur friends who are probably our fur children, um, loss of spouses, which is always devastating. Pandemic, devastating loss, events all over the world, fires, and one I'd like to also, being a 60 scoop survivor, a residential school survivor as well. I think we need to acknowledge that grief and loss. And so we recognize loss in ourselves, but I'm going to ask you to reflect upon a moment, and we'll take a couple of minutes right now. And how can you tell when someone else in another person or a community as a whole is experiencing grief? How does that get reflected in our social consciousness? How do we see it emerge? Because if we see how we see it, then we can start responding to it in different ways. There's in a grief course that I took, I learned that it's within North American society, it's standard to allow people to grieve for a year. And then after that year, there's always that side eye where you're like, you should be over it by now. And that's not the reality of how grief and loss works. So, how can you tell when someone is grieving even past that year? So, think about the long term impacts of grief in there as well. And maybe think about the long term grief, how it affects people, as well as that short term grief. When you take a couple of minutes right now to put it in the chat. So, if you don't mind, we'll take a minute or two for some quiet reflection before we move on. While everyone continues, I'm seeing a lot of emotional, physical, and behavioral changes. An interesting one was even flying flags at half mast. So as a society, we recognize grief and loss in different ways through our structural mechanisms. But there's what I'm seeing in the chat are so many different behavioral changes, from everything from irritation to outburst to withdrawal. There is no one way to express grief and loss and how people see it. What about a community? How might a community also experience grief? Thank you. So if you don't mind, keep putting everything in the chat. And at this point in time, I will ask Jackie to continue our narrative.
Thank you, everyone. This is actually a wonderful knowledge share. All the things that you have in the chat are far richer than what we're even presenting on this slide. And indeed, these slides are really just, opportunities for us to think about categories of how loss and grief might appear. So they're not limited. There's way more to talk about. But here today, some of the things that you mentioned is that there's persistent thoughts and feelings about the loss. So we find ourselves spinning and returning over and over again to what happened, how it happened, why it happened, when it's going to end, why did it happen to me, to us, to we. There can be a constant feeling that you're returning to the loss over and over, almost to the point where time has stopped. And I think from the chat here, and also for people in this room, you've probably seen that in people that you know in your own families, where there's almost like a person was so affected that they're still at that moment in time and still navigating the loss in a very, very huge way. There's feelings of deep sadness, sorrow, a heaviness in our body, our mind, and our spirit. There's feelings of anger, betrayal, or resentment. And there's a desire that people noted about isolating, disconnecting, staying away from people, even people that we love deeply, we want very much to spend time with. But there's just so much difficulty being in the presence of others sometimes when we have all these feelings. One of the ways that's noted in the chat that's really important to state here is that sometimes to get over some of these feelings or to move away from the isolation, to get out of the house, let's say, people will start using substances, and they might start engaging in sort of their strategy for coping better creates another very difficult coping problem for them, or coping complexity. In all of this, there's the fatigue that sets into the body, the mind, the spirit, the family, and the space that you live in. And there's a loss of spontaneity, a loss of lightness, and also a loss of a sense of belonging. And all of these things can make us feel far more fragile than we've ever felt before in our lives. Thank you for what you offered in the chat here. It really helps to see the points that you're making. It's sort of the story that we're trying to present here is living in the chat. Thank you. So what is the healing process and how does it happen? So first, there's ways of clustering the work around healing. And the first way is developing an emotional recognition of the loss. Sometimes people are seeking, they've got it in their mind that the person's there. They walk into the room and realize that the person's no longer there. So there's the awareness of the loss is not very deep, and the emotional recognition or the emotional knowing about the loss takes time. The other important thing is the feelings, like to allow space and time for the feelings of grief and loss, which can take all kinds of different shapes and forms and intensities, and to increase your capacity to be with these feelings. Turning towards the future is really important at some point in time to help lift us out of the loss and to begin to take care of ourselves, our families, our homes, and our work again. Making practical adjustments is really important, like really small, basic things, almost like not like making adjustments where to ensure that we're not waiting for somebody else to do something. We're not making meals for 3 people when perhaps you're the only one left. And learning to make those small changes can be very difficult at first, but they're part of the healing process too. So what we do helps us emotionally to shift our emotional recognition to more knowing and more understanding of the loss. Connecting with others and sharing your experience with them is super important. It's the profoundness of loss can invite, or some of the desire can be to move away from people. But what we're inviting you to do for the healing process is turn towards people and to engage with others. Thank you. So how do we do this? How do we move through these different actions to facilitate our own healing and the healing of our communities? So to support emotional recognition of loss and grief, we start by listening. And we start by listening and spending time with people, honoring their experience, and letting them speak without correction about how the experience is moving through them and their life. We gather, we provide, and we share or create stories, words, movements, music, dance, or art that expresses the feelings and the impacts. we try to find a way to make meaning for the loss. And we try to do that in relation to others through collective events. Validating and acknowledging the pain of the loss is very important. So listening, but also listening in a way that allows you to understand that, yes, oh my gosh, that's so hard. And to be able to say that authentically, and even if you don't say it, to know it and the person can sense your knowing of it, that's a form of validation. Encouraging others to take the time they need to heal and to be present to their experience, not to speed things up, and to realize that the timeline for healing is different for all of us. Reaching out to spiritual, cultural leaders and trusted leaders, friends, people who can provide us with guidance for the journey and introduce us to practices or processes that will help us to synthesize the loss and the grief is really important. Thank you. So turning toward the future, what does that entail? In a very simple way, it's about planning activities, and maybe planning activities that you don't want to do. But it's about taking care of yourself and even planning activities for your own self-care, and planning activities to engage in grocery shopping or cleaning the house, or, taking care of animals or children, making sure that you're reestablishing your daily routines, especially if you have others to care for as well. Planning simple activities sometimes can be hard, and it can feel really alien when you're feeling all the feelings that you identified earlier. So it's really important during those times to get people to support you, to plan them and to follow through, because the tendency is not to do them for a lot of people, especially at the beginning. We want to encourage actions to make sure that we're acting on our own behalf, our family's behalf, acting in the service of our well-being, our safety, and our protection. So making sure that we reach out to the people who are there to support us with getting our financial needs met, our basic needs, our health, our community and cultural needs, and our spiritual support. Thank you. So how do we make practical adjustments? Or what practical adjustments need to be made when we experience loss and grief? Firstly, we need to take more time to do ordinary things. Ordinary things are no longer ordinary. They're like new and difficult and arduous sometimes. So we want to make sure that we build in time to get through those things and not have expectations about ourselves and our capacity to complete tasks that are unrealistic and set us up for further disenchantment. We want to encourage engagement in new and valued social and community activities, to be outward facing, to move out of our homes, to move towards people, to move towards activities, to remember the things that we valued, and to make plans to engage in them, even if we don't feel like doing anything at all. We want to engage in action-focused problem solving and ask for support for this when it's hard to do. And what we mean by action-focused problem solving is problem solving where we're actors, we're taking steps, not where we're observing and waiting for something to happen, but we're actually taking the steps, small steps we need to take, and maybe for some big steps that they need to take. But it's important to take steps towards community, towards the future, towards the care that needs to happen for your family and yourself, and to plan specific steps to do that. We want to learn about all the resources we can. Some people are not interested in resources. They have a community of support, and they get beautiful support that way. Especially if you're somebody who's been isolating, or someone who's been disconnected from community, family, friends, and even yourself. You might need to reach out to different types of resources, and they may include helplines, or they might include a family doctor or a nurse practitioner or a leader in your community or at your workplace who can help guide you to other resources. The key thing in all of this is that we reach out, making changes to adapt to the loss and the grief and all the other changes associated with these losses that are yet to come is really important to do with others. It's a really incredibly heavy burden to do all by ourselves. So reaching out even when you don't want to, and keeping strands of connection with your community and with others, even if it's a text every once in a while, a phone call if you dare, and maybe a visit, even better. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the chat and the questions. Just a quick reminder, we'll be discussing the questions at the end. And at that time, we're going to really encourage this community that is here today to help participate in answering those questions. So once again, thank you to all the chat. I'm learning an incredible amount about how people see community, see themselves, and are learning and adapting through grief and loss. And we have to remember that there is no one expression of grief and loss, and each culture and our cultural background from our multiple cultures, as many of us as settlers or immigrants to Canada, or the First Peoples of Canada, are all experience that grief and loss in different ways, as our community supports us in different ways. So our question for this one, and feel free to copy links and share resources for this, because what we can do is share this out as well. So if people are grieving or experiencing loss, we can also collectively gather that information here in this place and share it. So how does your community, and community can mean city, it could be Indigenous community, it could be nation, it could be an extended family. So what is community to you, and how does your community support people who are deeply impacted by loss? Are there individuals or organizations that can support you, and are you willing to share those in the chat? So again, we'll take, if you don't mind, to take a couple minutes to reflect and think before we come back together to continue our narrative. So far, ceremony and sharing circles, 211 Ontario. Are there any organizations you can think of? Victim services, community centers. There's also those, I should put this in the chat myself, but there's the people who even guide us through grief and loss, whether it's religious organizations or funeral support centers. Can also be supports and guide people to solutions and to resources, counseling services. I like that one, CRC, emergency management friendly calls.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's some beautiful examples in the chat. Thank you to everyone for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So as you think about things, or if you're still looking up links and places to find things, I'd like to invite Jackie to discuss some national resources at this time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vicki. So these are 4 national resources. They're not the only resources, of course, but they are 4 entry points for people. So the first one is Helplines for Grief and Loss in Canada, and it gives you a number of different helplines. I think there's 8 there, and they're for people who identify in different ways or different age groups, but they have a really awesome list of helplines. And what these lines do, they're not crisis lines, so they have the time, and they're invested in hearing from you and spending time understanding experience. The Hope for Wellness line is probably well known to many of you here, and that's an Indigenous line, and it provides amazing resources that are about the historical context that Indigenous communities have endured and continue to endure. And it also has entry points for grief and loss. So it's a great resource, and they offer many different languages as well, so you can speak in your heart language. Helplines for grief and loss in Canada. Oh, sorry, we got that there twice. The Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association, somebody mentioned in the chat that hospice can be helpful. And hospice is usually located, there's usually they have regions usually, so you can usually find them somewhere in most communities, in urban areas anyways. They also provide outreach support virtually and by phone. So they're a really good support. They offer peer-led support. So they're people who've experienced loss themselves, and they can offer a very beautiful connection to people who are healing from loss. One thing that I'll say before we leave this slide is that somebody noted in the chat that it's important. It can be important not to help if you're not sufficiently healed or going through the healing process yourself, and that's really important. That's a really important note of reflection for us, and it's important to ask us if we're ready to be able to help somebody else, and are we far enough along our journey to be able to do that yet, and when is that, or is that ever the case for us? So for some people, that's the best way to mobilize in terms of their healing, and for others, it can be not so. So it's really important to know yourself, to talk to people, to figure out what the best pathway is for you, and to know that you can be in a conversation with somebody who's experienced profound loss without your loss becoming overwhelming is the important thing. Thank you. So a few reflections here. So the next slides will just be offering some thoughts for us in closing. But loss and grief have been identified by us and you as natural and part of our lives. During the early stages, each day brings anguish and the painful realization that the loss has really happened. And also the moments where it's like, no, that couldn't be. It couldn't have happened. So we go back and forth between these two extreme experiences, and it's really, really exhausting for people. So the shock and surprise occur repeatedly during the early stages, and they occur throughout the healing process. And for some people, and maybe more than some, lots of people, they occur through a lifetime. So the shock and the surprise are also part of the healing process. So something that, although difficult, it's necessary, and that each time we go through the experience, we deepen our emotional awareness of the reality of its happening, and also have an opportunity to realize how profound that connection was for us in our life. Thank you. So ambiguous loss is a very complex loss, and it can impact people and communities in profound and very, very extensive ways. The loss can be carried through generations, and it can change the quality of life for people who are several generations from the beginning of the loss, or from the first ambiguous loss. So it's really important to understand that sometimes we carry loss that we don't have a name for, words for, and we might not know how to speak about, because they've been sort of part of our community or our culture, but there's been no room or time, or the health of people has been poor, so the community's been busy taking care of others and not been able to help process the loss or the grief. Thank you. So what do we do to honor these feelings and experiences There are many things that we can do, and these are just a few. Talking circles are a really beautiful way to begin or to re-enter the healing process. And talking circles, you can be in those circles quietly. You don't have to talk in those circles necessarily. You being there and your felt presence is a communication, and it's a space for holding and for healing. Support groups can also provide that function, and they can be virtual or they can be in person. Ceremony for many different cultures is critical, and it can occur daily in different small ways, very important ways, or it can occur weekly, monthly, annually. So ceremony provides us with an opportunity to be with the feelings of loss, with others in our communities, and to take the time to reflect and know what the loss has meant and what we've done since the last time we've had a chance to reflect on the loss. Memorial days and events also provide us with that opportunity, and even walking groups or activity groups that get developed to start communities mobilizing in the service of their well-being and help. So these are just a few things. Thank you. So the critical thing in all of this is that we reach out. With grief, social bonds are broken, or they're disrupted, or they're changed. And with ambiguous loss, we're not sure if they're broken yet, but there's been a change. So reaching out allows us to restore or build new social bonds, to strengthen us, to hold us in place. They provide us with a sense of safety, with calmness and belonging. They allow us a place to be ourselves with our feelings. This allows us to gauge in action and to plan next steps. It's very difficult to act when we don't feel safe, or when we don't feel calm, or we don't feel like we belong in a place. Those feelings and those connections allow us to take a next step, or to imagine a next step. So reaching out is a critical and essential responsibility for all of us, and to support each other to do that. So the pandemic is something that we shared across the world. It's sort of like this point of convergence where all the different types of losses came together, and where we as individuals, as communities, as nations, as cultures, as different identity groups began to experience the impacts of the loss in different ways, and very thorough ways. So it affected our livelihood, the daily structure of life. It affected how much time we spent outside. It affected whether we saw people, whether we didn't. And sometimes for some people, and I speak for myself in particular, there is almost like a falling backwardness, and that didn't stop, and is continuing even now as we try to hold on and restore links with others and with the fabric of our lives, and reestablish a new rhythm of being in relationship and being connected to each other. So this is something that we share together. It had all those features of loss. And then, of course, people offered things in the chat that add into that. We lost family members and friends, and we didn't get to acknowledge or just to engage in ceremonies that would mark those events. So those losses don't have clear demarcations where we can spend time thinking about them. I'll let Vicki move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Jackie. Just some final notes from my aha moments. As I said, I purposely, after experiencing my own loss as a teenager, had to find my way along the pathway to healing. I'm not a very good person to go to counseling or express my feelings. But a few things really kind of stood out to me that I wanted to share. Now, is the grief and loss are always with us, and giving yourself that space to heal and express it however you need to, I think is critical. Now, one of the things I learned is that we all feel grief, and it stays with us. That loss, that emotional feeling, has been proven to impact not only our DNA but our physical self. You hear about heartbreak. Well,
Mhm.
heartbreak is actually a very real physical reaction in our body to grief and to loss. And it so not grief and loss is also it's painful waves of emotion that go through us. It's actual physical sensation, but it's also been proven to change not just our heart and our hormones, but it also can change our DNA. And you hear about intergenerational trauma. Those changes in our DNA, there it's certain researchers are starting to look and say, is intergenerational trauma real? And do those changes from that grief and loss and trauma change our DNA and get passed along to our children? And some researchers are saying yes. But within ourselves, too, my other aha moment is so, and I'll just use my own personal example. When my mother passed away, I felt that grief. It was intense. It was heartbreaking. It was in my heart. And every once in a while, something would trigger. It was like this big jagged, and I've seen a graph. I just couldn't replicate it. Big jagged grief of, waves of emotion that are that feeling of that heartbreak, that physical intense pain. And when people are in that active grief or in that active experience of loss, that painful moment, those periods of time are really close together. As time goes on, we have bigger gaps between that peak of grief. But the sensation of grief never really goes away. It can be 20, 30, 40 years, and you can be instantly transported back to that earliest moment of painful intensity. The feeling of grief does not decline. That physical feeling, it is only the time period between the episodes that grows greater. So we have to understand and kind of give people that understanding that grief is ongoing, it's permanent, it can last a lifetime. What helps us heal? Relationships can help us heal. Physical connection, mental connection, emotional connection, and act also just what Jackie mentioned, doing. So I find just even participating in this, reading the chat in this community, I just wanted to say thank you because we're all participating in our own healing. And that was the one thing that changed me was actively learning more about grief and loss helped me heal unlike anything else. So take that time to make some connections, but learn from others and don't be afraid to learn from others because even if it's been 20 years, there's no shame in saying, I still miss my mother, a job, a pet, what a family, a community, a country, and all the different ideas that have been expressed here. So as we kind of go into we have one final question today that I'd like to ask the community. So we've talked a lot about what grief and loss is, how your community can help you, but let's make the connection between the personal and the self. What has helped you or your community heal from overwhelming experiences of grief and loss? So if you could take a couple minutes now, and then we're going to, within a few seconds, within a minute, we'll go into the questions and answers because right now we're at 2:49 and we want to be respectful of everyone's time and provide that opportunity for questions. Right now we have 2 in the chat. So if you could enter in the chat what has helped you heal from community, help you and your community heal from overwhelming grief and loss. But if you have any questions at this time, please enter that in the Q&A so we can make sure we address those and provide some time for you.
Mm-hmm. Vicki, I just wanted to note that in the chat there's people who are making really important comments that although the experience of grief and loss is massive and huge, it's actually also important to play, to be creative, to break code and to laugh and not to feel guilty about experiencing lightness or joy. for periods of time, or for a long time, or forever.
Yeah. Be mindful of being out in nature. I love the SMASH clinics. I do want to learn more about that. And actually, a former employee of mine was actually, he now teaches and has done research into laughter yoga and presents sessions on that as part of healing from grief and loss. Shared projects, being positive. These are excellent. Thank you to everyone for contributing in the chat. And actually, an important one we haven't mentioned that I meant to, I want to say social, like thanks to Sandra for bringing this one up in the host and panelist section. Social media. What is the impact today of social media and connections? It can be both good and bad, where we see that grief continue across the country. We see war, we see turmoil across the country, climate anxiety, climate crises. And at this point, I'd like to actually bring in one of our questions, if you don't mind. And that is, I'm going to summarize it a little bit, as well. Ask for apologies for doing that. One of our anonymous attendees has asked, how can they grieve and move on when they feel that they're lacking and missing acknowledgement from community, from colleagues, and especially as they're struggling to grieve over the loss happening to our extended family and friends and innocent strangers in Palestine, in Ukraine, and around the world. How do we, in a country of immigrants and settlers and Indigenous peoples, use different forms? Like, how, I'm going to ask everyone to actually help us weigh in on the chat with that one. How can we grieve and move on when we feel alone? And that ties in so well with this question. What is helping you heal from overwhelming experiences and loss? Could you take a couple seconds to maybe provide some guidance to our anonymous member who is struggling when they feel like the media isn't giving them accurate knowledge, when they are feeling dissociated from their own community and disconnected? Jackie, do you have any suggestions for that one?
Well, certainly one of the things that I think about is that sometimes it can be very difficult to heal when people don't validate. So the very thing that we said is important, in order for us to progress along our healing journey, is to be in the presence of people who validate us. What I would encourage people to do in situations like this and others is to reach out to people that are safe, people from their community, people that can understand their own history and know it intimately, and can actually be collaborators with you on the journey that you're navigating alone. And bring those people in close to you, reach out to them and talk to them about this, and do whatever you can to make sure that you're connecting with safe people. Because being invalidated is very, very hard to endure when loss is so profound. So please reach out to your community, to people who would understand, and also protect yourself from media. So all of us in different ways have to protect ourselves from social media at times. It's really important to do that when social media is a source of invalidation. It's a source of harm for us. So protecting yourself that way is important. The other thing is, almost like being invested in your healing no matter what, and taking a stance that I am going to continue to acknowledge and to mobilize on behalf of my community or my grief in a healing direction, despite the fact that I might be doing this alone. So not waiting for validation to come from sources that aren't going to offer it, but finding sources and people that can offer that to you, and then healing no matter what, and making the choice and the commitment to yourself and your family, your people perhaps, that we're going to continue to take steps forward to ensure our well-being despite what's happening around us. That's what I would say. Vicki, would you add anything?
That's what I was thinking. And it kind of reminds me of something that I was taught many years ago. Not everyone can be everything to you or for you. For example, we can't expect our partners in life or our best friends to be that be all end all. And yet that's our kind of our romanticized idea of love and relationships these days. So I wouldn't worry about colleagues not understanding or media. Just what you said, I would say find that circle of people that are supportive of you and connect with you, and don't worry about the others.
Mm-hmm.
There, and that's so find the people that work for you to support you, and they are out there. We just have to take our time to find them. And I did skip ahead one question. I'd like to go back to it. It just was the way it worked out with the social media question. Is there a fourth type of loss? Loss that is slow moving but singular. For example, an aunt with dementia that dies, or a wife that dies over years from cancer. And I intentionally, I just wanted to thank our contributor for that one.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that one was, I left that question to the last because as a person whose mother passed away over 2 years from brain cancer, I'm still impacted by that. And at the end, I couldn't go to the hospital to say goodbye because I said goodbye when she wasn't in a coma. And people critique me for that. I'm like, she's not the person she was. That is not my mother anymore. And it seemed really cold hearted at the time, but I was only 13. And so, how there is those stages in loss, that long term loss. And when you go to have multiple people in your life or in yourself experiencing that, what I agree, I think it is a fourth type of loss that is slow moving and singular. I think it's very, very much
Mm-hmm.
true and something that we need to acknowledge. Grief and loss can be even before an event happens, it can be
Mm-hmm.
ongoing. And that is probably one of the more difficult types. Jackie, how would you suggest people manage that? I'm thinking today counseling, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't like counseling myself. I love
No,
going
no,
to
no.
therapist. What do you think?
I think what you said is brilliant, and indeed, ambiguous loss is ambiguous. It's that loss that can happen sometimes minute by minute, and then the anticipation. So there's what's been termed. There's lots of different ways of thinking about loss and grief, and there's lots of different terms. And we tried to keep it simple here today, but indeed there's more complexity. But anticipatory grief is some of what could happen when you watch someone progressively decline in your life. And and then, the loss is by a thousand cuts. And it's exceedingly painful. And it's almost, the idea of the frog boiling in water, like you kind of, loss becomes how you live during that period of life. And every day you kind of get used to a different burden of loss, and the recovery in that situation can take a long time. And and long-standing emergencies can do the same, where people aren't back in their homes for years sometimes, or people are away from their communities because of flooding and don't have clean water for years, and so there's all kinds of ways that we can categorize these things. The one category that I think about that is wide enough to hold those losses would be ambiguous. But I really I prefer not to use categories. I prefer the beauty of how you described it, the long, slow, sluggish, whatever words you use. Those are the words we must use when we're talking about our own loss. For us to say, I have an ambiguous loss, doesn't tell us anything about what we're experiencing. It's a concept. So, using your words and not trying to fit things into a category is really important. And this is, you're allowed to break code. We don't have to do it like everybody else, and we don't have to use the same words. And And in fact, speaking poetically about loss is healing, and giving the right words for the experience you're having in your body and in your life is really important. Thank you for that question or that reflection. Yeah.
Just want to let you know, Jackie, 2 questions have come in at the end.
Yeah.
And what I'm going to do, I would like to quickly wrap up. I'm going to invite everyone to stay after, for those of you that would like to stay, to answer the last 2 questions. And so while we can kind of wrap things up, we want to say thank you very much for joining us today. And we do have another webinar series. I'm going to ask April to speak to that. But after April is done, I invite anyone to stay who would like. We do have 2 more questions, and I'm going to state them quickly, and then we'll kind of come back to it. What are the warning signs to watch for to encourage someone to seek professional advice?
Yeah.
I think it's a critical question. That's why I'm inviting anyone who would like to stay after we kind of do a soft close. Please stay. And then another one, as a volunteer, this process is the same when working with emergencies. Are there organizations that help us after helping others, such as I'm thinking emergency debriefing. So April, I'll let you come back on, and then we're going to invite whoever would like to stay. We'll continue recording the session, but we also want to respect your time, knowing that we've been on here for 1 hour and 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Vicki and Jackie. This has been such an enriching conversation. And I'll just quickly let folks know that a survey will be popping up on your browser as soon as you exit the webinar session. We so appreciate your feedback to make sure we can make these sessions as helpful and informative as possible. And we do have another webinar coming up on Thursday, 10 to 11 a.m. Mountain Time, 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard. And that's about it. So we can continue this conversation for anyone who would like to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Vicki, I think you're on mute.
Yeah.
Oh, and I was being brilliant. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
Vicki's always brilliant, by the way.
Thank you, Jackie. So just to let you know, at the end of this presentation, we will be sharing out the slide deck and the slideshow. There are 3 pages that we'll be putting up on our Canadian Red Cross website. We just have to translate it first. And there are national resources. There's readings that we found very useful in creating this, as well as the Canadian Red Cross does have a number of resources available on its website, as does the International Federation of the Red Cross. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of go back to our questions that we had. And Jackie, I'm going to rely on you for a couple of these. The first one from David: what are the warning signs to watch for to encourage someone to seek professional assistance?
David, thank you for that question. That's a really important question. And I think, you know, we could, if we're trying to think about when is what's happening too much for the person that it's happening to. Usually what we see is a person not able to take care of themselves. They get stuck in the isolation. They find themselves having to cope in ways that are not, maybe not ordinary for them. Perhaps they're not someone who drinks or smokes or does those kinds of things, but signals of changes in behavior or changes the way they solve problems that are really big are important signals. The other thing is if people are taking care of others and they're not able to do it. So if they can't, you know, they can't complete a meal, they can't get food on the table, they can't get out for groceries, there's like, they really need support. This is, the grief has hit them so profoundly that they're almost, you know, some people can become immobile, like they can be so overwhelmed. And sometimes that's because there's previous trauma. And previous trauma adds a complex layer to this, especially if there's similar features, but even if there's not. An accumulation of traumatic events and traumatic experiences, and then a massive loss and grief experience that brings us down really low and really leaden in our life. can make it really difficult for some people to mobilize. When we notice that in other people, it's important to reach out to them. And the other thing is, people can become a risk to themselves in terms of suicide at those times. So it's really important that connection be sustained, that people actively reach out. And of course, the person might not agree and may say no. But we do our very best. And if there is risk, then we want to make sure we get in touch with their family member. Sometimes we might have to get in touch with emergency teams or with a crisis line to ask for guidance about how we deal with this. The person hasn't left their house in 3 years. They're hoarding, they're not eating much. They've lost 50 pounds, whatever it might be. But if the person is not doing ordinary things, not taking care of themselves, not able to move around with ease, not getting outside, and they're not able to communicate effectively. Maybe they're mute, they're not talking at all, which can happen in children, or they're experiencing really harsh tones of emotion like anger and rage a lot of the time. So those are kind of the signals that we look for about anything. Somebody whose distress is going beyond what they can bear. And those are really important to watch when somebody's grieving, especially when there's two people who've been together for a lifetime. Somebody talked about divorce in the chat, or two people who've lived together and they've been together for 60 years and one partner dies. Those are really difficult losses because these people are in each other's life day in and day out. And maybe for 30 years, they've been sitting in the same chair together for hours each day. So checking in on people is almost like the check-ins, not waiting for something to happen, but making it a practice when there's people who you see might be vulnerable. And the social contact is a way of establishing resiliency, like keeping them well enough and not descending further. So we want to try to keep them well enough so they can engage in their natural healing. But we also want to watch for those types of signals and to actively, reach out for help if we have to let the person know that, hey, I'm worried about you and I'm really scared, and a lot of things have changed, and you've lost a lot of weight and you're not eating and you seem really unwell to me. Being very straightforward is really important. And also, saying, I really want to help you get help. And then reaching out. And a lot of times when people have been shut in for a period of time or their health has diminished, we want to help them reach out to their family doctor because they need a whole systems check. Like Vicky said, this doesn't only affect us psychologically or socially, it affects us physically. So getting checked to see, how we are, and taking care of all the systems things that need to be taken care of, and then taking care of all the social connection and the psychological support thereafter. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I offer that, and please feel free to add in or to say more.
And then April also had a question. As a volunteer, the process is the same when working with emergencies. Are there organizations that help us after helping others? And yes, there's a lot of debriefing organizations, but I might kind of wrap us up a little bit earlier and suggest, April, and if anyone else is still here, please reach out to the rrr@redcross.ca email, because we can forward that to our MHPSS teams and to Jackie's team, to our disaster risk management teams on the Indigenous Peoples Help Desk and our disaster risk reduction team, because they actually have a wealth of resources available, and we can actually try to connect you up. So if anyone's interested in that information, please email us, because I know we have a lot of resources and partner organizations that we work with that can provide support as well. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Jackie. Thank you to April. And I think at an hour and 10 minutes, we can conclude now. Again, any more questions, please reach out to the rrr@redcross.ca, and we'll make sure that your questions go to the appropriate team. Thank you again.
Thank you, Vicki, for your awesome engagement. And thank you, April, for your work too.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.